Chapter 1785. Hermit Saint of Godgrave, the Lord of Shadows. The porters shivered. Night had fallen, and only the light of the bonfire illuminated the desolate plain. Flakes of ash danced in the air. Far away, the white phalanxes of the dead deity towered above the plain like mountains, and 3 pale moons were drowning in the darkness of the cold sky. It was a perfect environment to tell a scary story. Awakened Ray smiled faintly. Yes, the Lord of Shadows. Rain shifted a little to hear him better. She was haunted by an insufferable shadow, so of course, anything that had to do with shadows was of interest to her. The young man took a deep breath, cradled a cup of fragrant tea in his hands, and continued. Out there in Godgrave, the sky is usually covered by clouds. When the veil of clouds is torn, blinding light pours from an incandescent white abyss, incinerating anything that moves. But there is a place where light can never reach, a land that is forever shrouded in darkness. Out there in the darkness stands an ancient temple built of black stone. That is where the Lord of Shadows lives. Rain stared at awakened Ray incredulously. Is he an idiot? The young man had good control of his voice, drawing the listeners into the scene he was describing. But no, what was he doing? Were they in a theater? Why couldn't he just speak normally? Awakened Fleur turned away, blushing from embarrassment. Tamar of Sorrow closed her eyes with a stoic expression. The porters, though, seemed delighted and leaned forward a little, enjoying the story. Rain blinked a couple of times, then did the same, not wishing to stand out. Awakened Ray continued. The Lord of Shadows is believed to be a reclusive saint, but nobody knows for sure where he comes from. Nobody even knows if he is a human, really. He always wears a suit of black armor and wears a fearsome black mask. His voice is cold and insidious, and his powers are great beyond belief. He lives alone in the dark temple, surrounded only by the devils who serve him. The young man took a deep breath and then said quietly, allowing his voice to tremble a little. It's true, I've been to the temple and saw those devils myself. One is a living statue of a beautiful female knight. One is a towering hellspawn forged from black metal. One is an enormous serpent whose body envelops the entire temple, its scales like polished onyx. However, none of them are as frightening as the Lord of Shadows himself. His mask is carved from black wood in the image of an ancient fiend, and looking into its eyes is like looking into the abyss itself. He shivered and shook his head. I thought that I'd die right there and then, looking at him. However, the Lord of Shadow just stared at me for a while, unmoving, and then said in a voice that lacked all human emotion, I've decided not to kill you, Dreamer Ray. As if he needed a reason to allow someone to live, instead of a reason to take someone's life. Rain secretly threw a glance at her own shadow. How come that Lord of Shadows lived in a palatial temple and had a bunch of powerful minions serving him, while her teacher did not even have a place to stay? Was her teacher a bum among shadows? Unfair, one of the porters asked in a trembling voice. But awakened Ray, sir, how did you end up in that evil temple? Ray opened his mouth to answer, but it was Fleur who spoke first, perhaps afraid that he'll say something nonsensical. The spell sent us 3 to Godgrave. We found a place to hide and sent Ray to scout a path of escape, maybe find someone to rescue us. He stumbled into the territory of the Lord of Shadows by accident and was brought to the citadel by one of the Lord's echoes. Tamar nodded. Actually, the Lord of Shadows rescued several sleepers last year as well. That is where most of what is known about him comes from what those sleepers said after being sent to the Song domain. Well, we were actually lucky. I don't know if he would have gone out of his way to find me and Fleur, but there was someone else at the temple when Ray arrived. Ray stared at his 2 companions with resentment, indignant that they had spoiled his theatrical retelling of their first venture into the dream realm. Then he sighed and nodded. Yes, If I was alone, the Lord of Shadows might have sent me back on my own, or even disposed of me to avoid inconvenience. He's a bit sinister, to say the least. Luckily, at the time, Changing Star and a cohort of firekeepers were taking shelter in the temple. They were on a mission in Godgrave, but took time to risk themselves and rescue Fleur and Tamar. Lady Nephi's even persuaded the Lord of Shadows to help. If anyone can convince an eccentric powerhouse like him, it's her. Tamar sighed. The three of us could only hide. Even now that we have awakened, we would not survive a day in Godgrave. But Changing Star and the Lord of Shadows, they willingly went into the depths of the abomination-infested bones to save us. Because of it, they were surrounded by great nightmare creatures. She glanced at Fleur, hesitated for a moment, and added in a wistful tone, "The Lord of Shadows took us and used some kind of movement ability to cross more than 100 kilometers in a few seconds. Then, he threw us to the firekeepers and went back. We could only feel the ground shaking from time to time, but eventually both of them returned, battered but alive." Everyone seemed shocked. "They fought many great abominations, and won." Tamar spared a joyless smile and nodded. "In fact, many saints can prevail in a battle against a great nightmare creature of a lower class. Several of them, though, it's like a death sentence. Only Changing Star and a few others are capable. The Lord of Shadows, even though I don't know who he is, his powers are at least equal to those of the most valiant transcendents. He is without a doubt one of the most lethal warriors of this era." She looked into the fire. "Don't listen to Ray and his nonsense, though. The Lord of Shadows is just a saint. People say that he is eccentric, and I can understand why. Who would want to live in a death zone? Maybe he just hates people, or maybe it has something to do with his flaw. In any case, the three of us owe him a debt of gratitude. We would have been dead if not for his strength." Rain was deep in thought about the mysterious saint, but the porters seemed to have forgotten about his existence already. Instead, they leaned forward with glistening eyes. "So, Lady Tamar." Old Carol smiled excitedly. "Did you say that you met Changing Star and the firekeepers?" The other porters were similarly excited. "Wow, what is she like in real life? Is she as beautiful as in the recordings? Was Lady Cassia there as well? Did you fly on the chain breaker?" Rain rolled her eyes. Then, unexpectedly, she opened her mouth and said in a tone of nonchalance, "You guys, leave Lady Tamar alone. Also, if you want to know about Changing Star, just ask me. You might not know, but she taught me swordsmanship once. Oh, Nightingale gave me a few archery lessons, by the way. And I used to scold Saint Athena because she leaves dirty plates around the house. Tusk, that slovenly woman. What the hell am I doing? Why was she spouting nonsense? That was not like her at all. But unexpectedly, it was also a bit fun. Oh no, teacher has corrupted me." The porters stared at her, then exploded with laughter. "Right so, Ronnie, what is Lady Changing Star like? Are you sure that she taught you swordsmanship? Didn't you teach her instead? No one has seen that Shadow Lord without a mask. Maybe it was Ronnie all along." Rain spared them a bright smile. "Well, have you ever seen me and the Lord of Shadows in the same room?" There was another bout of laughter. Some time later, the roasted meat was finished, and the members of the survey team went back to their tents. The three awakened decided which one of them would guard the camp first and followed suit. Rain spent several hours revolving her essence. Deep at night, she finally sprawled on her sleeping bag in total exhaustion. She lingered for a while, then asked quietly, "Hey, teacher, do you know about that Lord of Shadows?" He remained silent for a while. "Sure, I know him quite well. Why are you asking?" Rain smiled in the darkness. No reason. It's just that you are a shadow and he's the Lord of Shadows. So, is he like your superior?" Her teacher's voice revealed a hint of indignation. "Who, that clown? My superior? Ha! If I wanted to, I could erase him from existence with a thought. She chuckled. But he has a huge temple and a bunch of powerful servants. He also seems close with Lady Nephi's. Didn't you say once that you're practically her boyfriend? Sorry, I don't mean to sound rude, but it seems more like he is her boyfriend. Instead, her teacher was appalled. I did say that, and by the way, I asked her on a date and she agreed. She was delighted to agree, even. Who can resist my charm? Rain grinned. I'm just saying. That Lord of Shadows, he seems to know what's what. Won't the other shadows mock you for being an underachiever because of him? No temple, no servants, no beautiful saintess hanging on your arm. Ah, I pity my poor teacher. Teacher is such an ascetic. Instead of an answer, a threatening growl resounded from the darkness. Her teacher seemed to be sulking and did not speak with her the next morning. Rain crawled out of her tent, disassembled it, and prepared for a long day of marching across the desolate plain. She was in a good mood because of having managed to tease her teacher successfully last night. There was no need to do the survey work anymore, so the team moved west at a brisk pace. They were also familiar with the terrain and could follow an optimal route instead of wandering aimlessly. Of course, Tamar of Sorrow had been exaggerating a bit when she said that they would go in a straight line. The Moon River Plain was within the borders of the Song domain, but the only citadel here was far to the south, at its very edge. And since there was nothing but the hollow mountains to the north, this land was wild and dangerous. There were plenty of nightmare creatures here, and so the survey team had to avoid the hunting grounds of the more dangerous abominations. Still, they were making good progress. The further west they went, the more canyons barred their path. By now, the members of the survey team were very familiar with crossing them, so much so that it had almost become a habit. They would try to find the place where a stone bridge once stood, since the canyons were usually narrow there. The remains of the bridges also further narrowed the chasm. Then, young Tamar would mount her wolf Echo and leap over the canyon while holding a rope. After fastening it on the other side, she would raise a simple pulley system. The carts and equipment would be transported over the chasm first, and the people would follow. The whole process was a bit tiring, but not especially dangerous. Even if the canyon started to wail and was suddenly flooded by rushing water, the ropes remained above the powerful current. The porters just had to be careful not to look down. The canyons were incredibly deep, their depths shrouded in inky darkness. Falling down meant death. The currents, however, were incredibly violent, so falling into the water was not much safer. The survey team reached another canyon and went through the familiar motions. This one was not very wide, but it was still going to take some effort to transport all the equipment to the other side. Rain, who was usually one of the last people to traverse the chasm, leaned on the cart she had been pulling and took a deep breath. Since the crossing was monotonous, and they had already gone through the process countless times, it was easy to grow numb and allow one's mind to wander. However, even while presenting a relaxed facade, Rain still maintained vigilance. She knew all too well that a moment of carelessness could mean death in the dream realm, which was why she was one of the first people to see it. Tamar and her Echo were already on the other side, and the ropes were drawn across the chasm. The carts had been attached to the hooks and pulled over the canyon. Now, it was time for humans to follow. There were 3 ropes, one for them to walk over, 2 to hold with their hands. Awakened Fleur was in the middle of crossing, and one of the survey specialists was waiting for his turn to follow. However, Rain was suddenly distracted by something. It was the dead man standing a small distance away from the resting porters. His gaze was just as empty and expressionless as ever. However, he had just turned his head, silently facing the canyon. She frowned. The pilgrim had always been passive and quiet. He never did anything except for following the survey team. Why had he moved now? Crap! Before anyone could react, there was movement in the canyon. An enormous, clawed hand rose from somewhere below and swiped at the survey specialist. Its desiccated palm was the size of his entire body, and the vicious claws seemed sharp enough to rip the man to shreds. Rain's eyes widened. Luckily, the surveyor staggered back and tripped, seemingly on nothing, just in the nick of time. The claws missed him by a hair's breadth, failing to rip his body apart. They did snap the 3 ropes, though. Fleur! Ray's shout tore apart the silence, but he was far away to do anything. What are you shouting about? She's an awakened. Fleur might not have been strong enough to survive a fall into the canyon, but she definitely could hold on to the ropes. It was the porters who were in real danger, because the enormous hand was already reaching toward them with its claws. What saved them wasn't a miracle, but the cold steel of Tamar's sword. The legacy girl had been on the other side of the canyon, watching the others cross. She reacted at the first sign of danger. The echo was standing guard further away, so she simply jumped into the chasm without wasting any time. Tamar of Sorrow, like all awakened, possessed 2 awakened abilities. One allowed her to step on the air. She could do it once as a sleeper, and twice now that she had awakened. The second ability allowed her to burst with startling speed for a short amount of time. She was so fast, in fact, that it seemed as if she was simply teleporting from place to place. Which was how Tamar crossed the canyon without the help of her echo. By the time she landed on the other side, her sword had already woven itself from sparks of light. It was a brutish Zweihander with a leather-bound ricasso. Tamar was a young woman of medium height, so the great sword looked comically large in her hands. She did, however, wield it with effortless ease. She activated her awakened ability again and shot forward, delivering a terrifying slash to the wrist of the hidden abomination's arm. Despite the fact that it was as thick as the trunk of an ancient tree, the Zweihander cut through the tough hide, steel muscles, and adamantine bone, severing the creature's enormous hand. Tamar seemed to disappear from one spot and appear in another in the blink of an eye. At the same time, the hideous hand separated from the creature's arm in a flood of viscous blood. It fell heavily on the ground and continued moving, crawling toward the terrified porters. Ray! Finally, awakened Ray reacted. He dashed to intercept the hand, while Tamar turned to the canyon. By then, the nightmare creature was already climbing over the edge. It was huge and hideous, with a gaunt body and long, sinewy limbs. Its head was disproportionately large for the emaciated torso, with 2 little bloodshot eyes and an enormous crimson maw. Worst of all, it seemed to possess too many arms. Tamar had severed one at the wrist, but 3 hands were already reaching toward her. 2 more were gripping the edge of the canyon, pushing the giant up. There was barely any time to react. The young legacy did something that most warriors would never do in a battle. She jumped high into the air, dragging the great length of the brutish Zweihander behind her. A jump was usually tantamount to death, because one could not control their direction or react to the opponent's attacks without standing on the ground. A strike delivered in the air was also weaker than a strike delivered while using a solid surface for support. However, that did not apply to Tamar. She pushed off the air once, soaring to greater height, and then once more, changing her trajectory completely. At the same time, she spun like a wheel and brought the Zweihander down on the enemy's arm. This time, the force contained in the strike was not augmented by the startling speed of her awakened ability, but it was still fearsome. The arm of the abomination was not severed, but the great sword bit deep, not only slicing the veins and muscles, but also cracking the bone. She had evaded the other 2 hands by jumping over them, as well. Tamar would have been clear if not for the fact that at that moment, the creature's 2 sinister eyes locked on her, and another 3 hands shot at her from the canyon. The young legacy faltered for a split second. Then a sharp arrow whistled past her and pierced one of the abomination's eyes. A moment later, another arrow sank into the remaining eye of the hideous nightmare creature, effectively blinding it. A pained roar shook the plain. Landing on the ground, Tamar activated her awakened ability and dodged to the right, avoiding the grab of the blinded abomination. She would have been in trouble if it could see, but now, things were different. Shaking the fetid blood off the blade of her great sword, she prepared to attack and glanced back briefly. Ray was busy pushing back the severed hand, so who had made those stunningly accurate shots? The beautiful porter girl, Ronnie, was standing near the pile of unloaded equipment, holding a simple recurve bow. Her black hair was dancing in the wind, and there was a strangely serene expression on her pale face. Her black eyes were glistening with something that resembled excitement. She was already drawing the bow again, the fletching of a handmade arrow brushing against her white cheek. A little stunned, Tamar turned back to the enormous abomination. She did say that she was decent with a bow. If that was decent, then Tamar did not even know what great was. As she pushed her body forward, a stray thought surfaced in her mind. Ronnie had also said that she had some experience trekking in the wilderness and could handle a sword fine. Suddenly, Tamar wanted to know what her definition of fine was. The situation was not good. Ray had managed to stall the monstrous hand, hacking it to pieces with his weapons. He wielded a short sword in one hand and an axe in the other. Rain had blinded the abomination with her arrows, and Tamar disabled 2 of its arms. The problem was that the creature had just too many of them. Rain had already counted 9, and more were rising from behind the climbing monstrosity like a ghastly forest. Worse still, it was an awakened abomination. She had aimed at the obvious vulnerability first, the eyes, but other than that, there wasn't a lot of damage she could do. Even if her arrows pierced the tough hide of the creature, it would not harm it too much. Tamar faced the forest of monstrous arms with grim resolve, wielding her hefty Zweihander with daunting skill. She used both of her abilities to dance between the barrage of killing blows. The young legacy seemed like a steel whirlwind, alternating unpredictable jumps with short bursts of stunning speed. Torrents of fetid blood were released into the frigid air from her great blade. She managed to stall and damage many limbs of the abomination, in large part due to the creature having been blinded, but could not advance to attack its body. Crap! Rain dropped her bow and unsheathed her sword. Why are you just standing there? Get back! The petrified porters were stirred by her shout and staggered away from the carnage. Miraculously, none of them was dead yet. The abominable claws rained down in pursuit of the elusive legacy girl, sending pieces of stone flying. A net of cracks spread on the ground from each missed blow, viscous blood spilling into the narrow fissures. Rain dashed forward and supported awakened Ray, who had managed to sever 2 of the hideous hand's fingers, but almost got pierced by the long claw of the third. They were in a stalemate, and that stalemate wasn't in their favor. The creature was continuing to climb up from the canyon, and once it crawled onto the plain, whatever resistance Tamar was able to offer would be overwhelmed. So someone had to reach the abomination and deal it a mortal wound. Rain would have gone herself, but she was mundane. Her Takai would not be able to slay the giant. Ray, on the other hand, was awakened and wielded enchanted weapons. Better yet, he could become imperceptible. So, with come luck, his blade would reach the creature's neck without being blocked by the countless claws. Go, I'll finish this thing off. The young man glanced at her with wide eyes, hesitated for a split second, then nodded and disengaged. He must have thought the same. A moment later, Ray was gone. Literally. He activated his awakened ability and dissolved into the air. There was no sound, no smell, no anything. It was as if he had never existed at all. Rain brandished her Takai, deflected a terrifying claw, and then kicked the severed hand with all her might. The hand was the size of an adult human and weighed quite a lot. Still, Rain's kick sent it rolling backward. With 2 fingers missing, it had turned rather clumsy. The bizarre thing was still trying to turn itself over when she dashed forward, turned her sword, and thrust it down, using all of her own weight to make the strike more powerful. The tack pierced the monstrous palm, slid between the bones, and nailed the severed hand to the ground. It was a mundane blade, so an awakened abomination could easily snap it. However, even an abomination would have to follow common reason to achieve that. It would need proper grip and support at least, ideally good leverage. Laying on the ground, impaled through the center, the monstrous hand had none of those. So it just struggled fiercely, unable to free itself for now. Rain staggered back, then looked up to evaluate the situation. Tamar had managed to sever several more arms, but was hopelessly stuck in the avalanche of monstrous limbs. Blinded, the creature flailed them with no sense or reason, making a mess of the plain. Ray would be having trouble closing in. As well, he might have been invisible, but the space between the survey team and the massive body of the climbing abomination was full of stone shards and deadly claws. Ray was still a corporeal being, so making way through the carnage was not going to be easy. On the opposite side of the canyon, Floor had climbed the ropes and was now standing on the edge, shouting something as she summoned her memories. Rain couldn't quite hear what the pretty healer was shouting, but she managed to read her lips. "Tyrant, it's a tyrant. Damn." Rain had never faced an awakened tyrant before, nor had she ever wished to. As she faltered for a moment, shaken by the revelation, a blurred silhouette shot over the chasm. Then the echo of the giant wolf landed on the tyrant's back, tearing at its shoulders with sharp claws and sinking vicious fangs into its neck. That damned thing finally made it across the canyon. Tamar's echo seemed like a fallen beast or monster. At best, it wasn't quite powerful enough to destroy an awakened tyrant outright. However, it was very large, and it weighed a lot. The abomination was still trying to climb out of the chasm, hanging awkwardly with half of its massive torso towering above the edge. When the monstrous wolf landed on its back, the wolf's weight was added to the tyrant's own, pulling it into the deep abyss. It swayed back precariously. A frenzied shriek escaped from the creature's maw, and it flailed its arms in the air. It was still holding onto the edge with 2 hands, but now more of them scratched the stone with their claws, leaving deep grooves in it. The tyrant's fall was arrested. With so many hands trying to keep the abomination from falling, Tamar received a bit of breathing room. Without wasting even a split second, she dashed forward. Ray the hands. Her Zweihander drew a beautiful arc in the air, then fell down like the blade of an enormous guillotine. It severed the fingers of one of the 2 main hands the tyrant was using for support. At the same time, the fingers on the other hand were suddenly torn apart, and a vague silhouette of a young man revealed itself in the air. He was hacking at the fingers with his weapons, aiming to damage the joints between the phalanxes. Rain used her leg to throw her bow into the air, caught it, and knocked an arrow on the string in one fluid motion. A moment later, the arrow pierced into the deep wound dealt by Ray, disabling one of the fingers. With both of the main support hands damaged, the rest could not hold the weight of the tyrant anymore. When the echo jerked its head and pulled the abomination back with all its weight, the ghastly creature finally slid off the edge and disappeared into the depths of the canyon with a deafening howl. Rain trembled and lowered her hands. Damn, that was intense. She exhaled slowly, then glanced at the porters. Everyone was in one piece. The survey specialists were all fine as well. Which was more than a little unexpected. Did my teacher protect them secretly? Rain suspected that he did, especially because the dead pilgrim was suspiciously missing. Had the dead man been swept into the canyon in all the mayhem? Or had her teacher pushed him into the chasm while no one was looking? She would have to ask him later. But it was too early to relax still. Picking up her quiver, Rain lamented the loss of several arrows, then circled around the pinned hand of the tyrant and approached the edge of the chasm. She stopped near Ray and Tamar. All three of them looked down. The depths of the canyon were shrouded in darkness, and it was impossible to say how far down its bottom was. Ray swept his hair back nervously and looked at them. "Do you think it's dead?" Tamar lingered for a moment, then pursed her lips and hesitantly shook her head. "I haven't heard anything from the spell." Turning back, she glanced at the severed hand that Rain pinned to the ground with her sword. "Go finish that thing off, Ray. It should be the tyrant's minion. What a bizarre creature by the dead gods, who had countless hands instead of proper minions." Ray sighed, then readied his weapons and headed away from the edge. A storm of sparks rose around the legacy girl, and then the wolf echo manifested itself behind her. There was no need to let it be damaged by the fall. She had simply dismissed it, then summoned it back. Finally, Tamar turned to Rain and studied her for a moment. Then she scowled. "You." However, before she could finish the sentence, a chilling wail resounded from the depths of the canyon, reverberating across the plain. It was like the world itself was weeping. The flood was coming. It was impossible to hear her voice now, this close to the chasm. It was also impossible to discern what Fleur was shouting. Rain stared across the canyon in confusion. The awakened healer was jumping and waving her hands in the air, pointing at them with a desperate expression on her lovely face. "Dak thop being all dak." Rain could barely hear anything because of the wailing. "Ag what is trying to pack, attack, crack. Back." Suddenly, his eyes widened. Rain looked at Tamar in panic, but it was already too late. The edge of the canyon had been damaged severely by the barrage of blows dealt to it by the tyrant. The weathered stone was broken and cracked. And just then, it finally crumbled. Before Rain could do anything, the entire side of the canyon suddenly moved, and then collapsed, falling into the wailing darkness. And the two of them were pulled down with it, plummeting into the bottomless chasm alongside countless tons of broken stone. Life was like that. You could train your body tirelessly to turn it into a tenacious, resilient tool. You could practice swordsmanship and archery until your hands bled, temper your observation skills and analytical thinking, and test yourself against countless opponents in real combat to turn shallow knowledge into deeply rooted experience. And then, you can still die because of nothing but bad luck. Rain felt resentful as she plummeted into a bottomless abyss, surrounded by an avalanche of shattered stone. But no, that was not true. Her current predicament was not due to misfortune. She was at fault. It was her who had not been cautious enough, perceptive enough, and smart enough. All the signs had been there, the cracks in the stone, the weathered state of the canyon walls, the devastating power of the tyrant's blows. She should have put two and two together. She should have done better. So Rain had no one to blame but herself. Still, she was indignant. To die like that, it was really unfair. All these thoughts flashed through her mind in the span of a moment. Then, she gritted her teeth and tried to think of a way to survive. First things first, the fall itself would not kill her just yet. The bottom of the canyon was far away, and she could survive bouncing off its walls once or twice. The most pressing threat were the falling boulders. They were massive and heavy enough to turn Rain into a pancake, or at least smash her skull open. Raising her arms, she tried to shield her head. A moment later, something slammed into her forearms and she felt sharp pain. Luckily, the boulder was not large enough to crush her, so her bones weren't even broken. The next one, though. Catching a glimpse of it, Rain shuddered. It was like a wall of rough rock was pursuing her, mere moments away from colliding with her fragile body. There was no chance to evade. A moment before she was crushed by the massive slab of stone, however, something strange happened. The darkness seemed to touch it lightly, and the enormous boulder shattered into a million pieces. Instead of being killed, Rain was simply showered by small pieces of debris. Teacher. Her teacher rarely helped her directly. However, it seemed that he was unwilling to let his student perish so senselessly, and interfered, just like he had interfered to keep the porters and surveyors from being ravaged by the tyrant. I take back all the bad words I've called him. There was no time to feel touched, but Rain still felt a strange warmth in her heart. Then she turned her head to find the only source of salvation there was, apart from her eccentric shadow companion. Tamar of Sorrow. The legacy girl could take 2 steps on the air, so if anyone could help Rain survive, it was her. If she would even bother wasting her time to save a mundane porter, of course. It would be much easier, not to mention safer, to only worry about herself and let Rain fall to her death. Where is she? Everything was happening so fast, but time also seemed to slow down. Plummeting into the wailing darkness, Rain looked around feverishly and tried to catch a glimpse of young Lady Tamar. But she could not see her. However, that was not because Tamar was nowhere to be seen. Rather, it was because Rain was looking too far. She did not expect that the legacy was nearly upon her, and only realized it when something blocked her vision. What? Then Rain gasped as something hard rammed into her abdomen. Arg! As it turned out, Tamar had been quicker to react. After regaining her bearings, she swiftly evaluated the situation, located Rain, and then used the first of her 2 steps to arrest her fall and launch herself to intercept the falling porter instead. The hard thing that had collided with Rain's abdomen, knocking the wind out of her, was the legacy girl's shoulder. Since Tamar was clad in a suit of plate armor, her steel pauldron was not at all soft. Grabbing Rain around the waist, she continued to fly toward the wall of the canyon. However, another huge boulder barred their path, hissing a stifled curse. Tamar used the second step to change their direction and avoided it. Now, her dormant ability was exhausted. She would not be able to use it again before touching a solid surface with her feet. They flew into the darkness, falling deeper and deeper, but at the same time getting closer to the wall. Tamar shielded Rain from falling debris and yelled. Zold then. A moment later, Rain's body was violently jerked and came to a halt. Oh crap, that hurts. She opened her eyes and tried to assess the situation. The wailing rising from the depths of the canyon was absolutely deafening, making her ears ring. She was surrounded by darkness. The sky was like a narrow line of light far, far above. Tamar was hanging from the damp wall of the canyon. One of her hands was thrust into a narrow crack, while the other was still holding Rain. I'll be damned. They were actually alive. Well, for now. Since Tamar had technically landed on something, she could activate her dormant ability again. Then, like a squirrel, she could slowly make her way back to the surface while carrying Rain. There was a big problem, though. The canyon was weeping, which meant that it was going to turn into a raging river at any moment. Rain couldn't really see well in the darkness, but she thought that she noticed a panicked look in the legacy girl's eyes. Then they were enveloped in the roar of rushing water. A moment later, the flood slammed into them like a concrete wall. Rain did not even have time to scream. Tamar's hand was violently wrenched out of the crack, and they were carried away, deeper into the canyon. The last thing Rain remembered was the sight of a solid surface of stone, approaching her at terrible speed. She was cold and tired. Everything hurt, so Rain did not want to wake up. I'll just sleep 5 more minutes. She couldn't be late for class, but she could, a little bit. If she pretended to be pitiful, maybe Mom would let her sleep a bit more. Only, wasn't her mom far away? And there were no classes anymore. Instead, she was. Opening her eyes, Rain stared at the gray sky. Drops of rain were falling from above, cooling her face. She studied the sky for a bit, then flinched and sat up. She was laying on the solid ground, surrounded by the vast expanse of the Moon River Plain. There was a small fire crackling near, with her teacher warming his pale hands over it. The battered figure of Tamar of Sorrow was laying on the other side of the fire. She seemed to be in a rough shape and still unconscious. Rain blinked slowly. "We're alive." That was good news. The bad news was that she had no idea how they had escaped the canyon and where they were. She vaguely remembered being surrounded by soft darkness and carried by the raging current. But then, at some point, she must have passed out. It was hard to differentiate one part of the plane from the other, but Rain did not think that she recognized the surroundings. The members of the survey team were nowhere in sight as well. Letting out a deep sigh, she turned to her teacher and asked hoarsely, "What happened?" He looked at her and smiled. "Well, you two fell into the river, and I fished you out." Rain nodded slowly. "How far were we carried by the current?" He shrugged. "Pretty far." "It's okay." Since both of them were alive, the situation could still be salvaged. They could find the survey team, maybe, and return to the main camp of the road crew, or proceed to one of the advanced camps on their own. Or, Rain looked at her teacher and forced out a smile. "Teacher, you are so kind and powerful. Can't you take us back?" He responded with a smile of his own. "Oh, sure I can." However, his voice was a little sinister. "Look at that poor girl, Tamar. She's barely alive. It would be really kind of me to take you both back, wouldn't it? One might even say that only a heartless monster wouldn't, so I really should. But I won't." Rain's smile grew a little forced. "What, really? Come on. It won't even be that hard for you." Her teacher nodded. "Really? If you want to get out of here alive, well, what can I say? All you need to do is awaken. Do that and you'll be fine." With that, he gave her a pleasant smile and disappeared into her shadow. A moment later, his voice resounded from the darkness. "Alternatively, that Lord of Shadows, he seems to know what's what. You can ask him for help." Rain stared at her shadow incredulously, then took a deep breath. "I take back everything I took back. That petty bastard." After welcoming the fire keepers for a few short days, the nameless temple had grown silent once again. However, the silence was not going to last long. Soon enough, the dark realm that Sunny had built in the heart of Godgrave would become a hive of activity. Due to the deal he had made with Morgan, his citadel was to be made into a secondary staging ground for the Sword Army during the war. A relatively small, but elite contingent would be stationed here, using the temple as their operation base. But the peace and quiet would be gone long before that. After all, the soldiers had to live somewhere. They needed beds, places to cook and consume food, storage space to keep a large amount of supplies, an infirmary, and so on. All of these things had to be built before the war started. There were so many things that went into waging a war. A military conflict between Awakened was different in many ways, but still fundamentally similar to any other war in human history. It demanded an unfathomable amount of logistical preparations. Sunny felt dejected. It had taken him a lot of effort to restore the nameless temple to its present state. Now, however, it would be turned into an actual citadel, a place that existed to serve as a safe haven for the people in the dream realm. There would be a small army of workers coming here to perform all the laborious tasks soon, which was not a bad thing. However, he had grown used to the peaceful silence. Today, there were only 2 humans under the roof of the ancient temple. One of them was Sonny himself. The other was Cassie, who had arrived as the seneschal of the great clan Valor to assess the state of the citadel and collect all the necessary information to launch the construction. At least that was the official reason. Sonny had thought that Nephi's would come personally. He was a little relieved that she was not here. His mind was burning in anticipation of their upcoming date, so seeing her before that would have been somewhat embarrassing. It was nice to see Cassie outside the context of their deal as well. The temple itself must be off-limits to the soldiers, unless it is to use the gateway. Of course, they can retreat inside if we are under attack and the outer perimeter is breached. Even then, I will not allow them to venture into the inner sanctum and the underground level. Cassie turned her head slightly. There is an underground level. Sonny smiled. Don't pretend you don't know. Nephi saw it, which means that you saw it too. The young woman coughed in embarrassment. Right, sorry. It's a habit of mine to act appropriately oblivious. Otherwise, people get uncomfortable around me. He spared her a long look. Since it was only the two of them in the temple, Sonny had dismissed Weaver's mask. It felt strange to walk around with a bare face as the Lord of Shadows, even if Cassie could not see his expression, only her own. He shook his head. I doubt there is anyone in the world who knows the extent of your abilities and the depth of your foresight better than me, Cassie. So, you don't need to worry about making me feel uncomfortable. There is also no one who knows me better than you, now. There is really no other person either of us can trust more. She smiled faintly. I'll keep that in mind. Sonny hesitated for a few moments, then led her outside. The territory around the temple is mostly cleared of nightmare creatures. There will be no problem building barracks and all the necessary facilities around it. My shadows will help protect the perimeter. You should know how powerful they are. The base will be very safe, all things considered. She shook her head. We can't rely on your shadows to maintain security, Sonny. After all, you are expected to participate in the battles against Song. Who knows if their presence would be required somewhere else? Sonny contemplated for a moment, then nodded. You are right. It felt very strange to be discussing the inevitable realm war so casually, and yet here they were. Studying her delicate face, he asked, who do you think stands the better chance of winning? Cassie tilted her head a little. It's hard to say. The sword domain has a stronger military. It also has better strategists. Most importantly, there are the Ivory Tower and the Nameless Temple. It is all but inevitable that the King of Swords will arrive to Godgrave before the Queen of Worms. With him here, the forces of valor will venture into the Hollows sooner and conquer local citadels faster. It's hard to imagine how such an advantage won't snowball into a crushing avalanche. She hesitated for a moment. However, the Song domain is unpredictable. There seems to be no reason for them to be eager to fight this war. If anything, they should be scrambling to avoid it due to how disadvantaged they are. And yet, they are as eager as the rulers of the sword domain, which means that they are hiding something. Well, of course they are. Her expression darkened a little. That encounter between you and the skinwalker near Ravenheart. The emissaries of the House of Night were clearly in contact with Prince Mordred. Perhaps they have brokered some kind of deal behind the scenes. There are other possibilities as well, but at the end of the day, none of it matters. Sonny raised an eyebrow. It doesn't. Cassie remained silent for a moment, then said calmly, no, because neither Song nor Valor will win the war. We will win the war. He laughed. You say it with such conviction. However, isn't the whole thing predicated on Nephi's achieving supremacy without the help of the spell? And there is no saying if she will, least of all if she'll do it on time. It's all a gamble. Cassie faced him and smiled faintly. Sure, but so was every other step along the way. Yet here we are still standing. She hesitated a little, then added in a quieter voice. Plus, it's not entirely a gamble. Sunny sighed, then led her back into the temple. It's not. The young woman lingered with the answer. Eventually, she said in a subdued tone, "The six of us, those who came back from the tomb of Ariel, all have strange gaps in our memory. But my memory has been affected the most. Sorry, I haven't revealed that secret to anyone before you, Sunny, and it's not easy to admit. My memory is really, severely damaged and I can't see the future anymore." She took a deep breath. "But there was a time when my memory was intact, and I could learn a lot about the future from my visions. That version of me must have known that there would be a war, and that Nephis would have to defeat the sovereigns without challenging the fourth nightmare." Sunny considered her words carefully. "You mean?" Cassie nodded. "Yes, if that version of me did not attempt to create contingencies, it means that she saw a way to win the war. Therefore, perhaps it is not as big of a gamble as you think." Sunny hesitated for a while. He knew that Cassie had been in a fragile mental state for the past 4 years, not only because of losing her ability to see glimpses of the future, but also because much of her past was shrouded by fog. After all, he had been the purpose and cornerstone of all her schemes, and her schemes were truly life-consuming. When he turned fateless, a huge chunk had been ripped out of her memory, replaced by oblivion. So he didn't really want to dispel her hopes, but it wasn't good to let her rely on them either. He sighed. "Or you have never known about the future after the tomb of Ariel at all, because the future has always been meant to become unclear after that." Suddenly, there was a strange intensity on Cassie's delicate face. She faced him and kept quiet for a few long moments, struggling to contain her emotions. Sunny had an idea of what she was thinking about. "Even if I ask you, I won't remember the answers, will I?" He shook his head slowly. "You won't." Of course, it would be great if Sunny could fill the gaps in her memory and let Cassie feel like herself again. But he couldn't. Between the two of them, there was a peculiar and bitter connection. Sunny had been forgotten by the world, but Cassie had forgotten herself. He struggled to judge which one of them was more pitiful. Still, he wanted to console her, even if only a little. Sunny looked away with a sigh. "Of course, that doesn't mean that you never will." Cassie seemed frozen by his words. She raised a hand, then lowered it again. "There is a way for your existence to be restored." Sunny hesitated, with a dark expression on his face. Of course, he had been contemplating that issue for a long time. In the end, he had determined that there was. There was a single question at the root of the problem. Why had the thieving bird stolen his fate? Sure, the loathsome thing seemed to be obsessed with everything that concerned Weaver, but Sunny did not think that it was the only reason. After pondering the question for a while, he had developed a certain suspicion. He had lost the connection to the nightmare spell after becoming fateless, which meant that carrying the nightmare spell had something to do with one's fate. Perhaps fate was the medium through which the infection spread. In any case, the creature which now possessed his fate would therefore possess his connection to the nightmare spell as well. So why would the thieving bird want something like that? To answer that question, one had to realize that the creature that Sunny had met in the nightmare was not the real thieving bird. The real thieving bird was long dead. Instead, the odious thing he had run into at the estuary was a replica of the vile terror created by the spell. And a replica could only exist in the illusory realm of the nightmare. A carrier of the spell, however, a carrier of the spell would be expelled back into the real world once the nightmare was over. They would have a way to go back. So, Sunny had come to believe that the real reason why the thieving bird wanted his fate was to become a carrier of the nightmare spell, and slip through the cracks of the illusory realm, finding a backdoor to reality. If so, that would be the greatest prison break in history. Quite a suitable feat for the greatest and most vile thief to have ever lived. Very few creatures could find a way back into existence after having been destroyed for thousands of years, and in such an original way. Therefore, the creature that had stolen his fate and was now in possession of it was not gone. It had not been erased forever by the collapse of the nightmare. It was somewhere out there, in the real world, liberated from its illusory prison and free to roam the world, stealing anything that had caught its fancy. Which meant that it could be hunted down and killed, and that he could get his fate back from it somehow. Sonny was nowhere near powerful enough to risk facing accursed terror, let alone accursed terror that neither gods nor demons had been able to deal with. Even the void beings were said to have loathed the vile thieving bird, which meant that they had suffered from its mischief as well. The damned bird was a real menace. More importantly, though, he didn't know if he even wanted to get his fate back. Despite everything, he wasn't sure. Because there were strings attached to regaining his fate, both literally and figuratively. Some days, Sonny woke up and wanted nothing more than to be remembered. Some days, he woke up and felt that he would never give up his freedom, which he had paid for so dearly. But Cassie deserved to know that there was a possibility, at least. He sighed. There is a way, however. Sonny's voice turned heavy. There is a price to pay if one wishes to become fateless. There is also a price to pay if one wishes to become fated. And I'm not sure if I want to pay that price. They reached the courtyard, where a lonesome tree stood, its leaves rustling in the darkness. The tree was feeling much better after being tended to by Shakti. It was doing much better, in fact, than it had in the outskirts, even though there was no sun to shine on its leaves and bathe it in warmth. The two of them looked at it in silence, Sonny with his own eyes, and Cassie as well. After a while she asked, "Why did you plant this tree in your citadel?" She was thinking about another tree, perhaps, one that he had burned on the forgotten shore. It would be easy to imagine why the sinister Lord of Shadows would keep a tree like the Soul Devourer in his temple. However, this one was perfectly mundane and did not even bear fruit. Sonny hesitated for a while, then looked at the base of the tree's trunk. There, 3 lines were carved into the bark. "It's a memorial tree." Cassie turned to him silently. He smiled. "A long time ago, I carved 2 lines into it as a grave for my parents. Later, I added a 3rd as a grave for myself. This is my citadel and this is my grave. I think it's quite fitting." Sonny lingered for a moment and added, "I've never told you about it, so maybe you'll remember." However, she did not. Cassie seemed distracted for a moment and then said calmly, "Should we proceed to the actual discussion then?" So she had known that about him as well. He smiled and summoned the shadows, manifesting them into 2 chairs and a table. Soon, another avatar of his arrived, carrying a tray with tea and refreshments. This one was the naughty shadow, and Sonny was not controlling him directly. That was why there was a subtle, but unmistakably lecherous smile on the bastard's face. He stared at the avatar with murder in his eyes, and the naughty guy hurriedly changed his expression. He was even extra gallant when pouring Cassie tea. Her face crumbled a little, and then she let out a melodious laugh. "Sorry, I just can't get used to that ability of yours." Sonny smiled. "That's all right. Sometimes I feel like I'm not used to it either. Well, and sometimes I feel like I am actually too used to it. It's a strange thing." He sighed and dismissed the avatar. But then again, the very idea of normalcy seems more and more distant the further on the path of ascension we walk. As saints, we are already far removed from what a normal human would be, some more than others. You must be experiencing it yourself, with the volume of alien memories you experience and the number of people you perceive the world through. Cassie's ascended ability was not limited to vision. She shared all senses of her marks, So, in a way, she had experienced being young and old, strong and weak, sick and healthy, male and female. That kind of experience was not something a human would ever be privy to, and it must have changed her perception of herself as well. Sonny himself was living several lives at the same time. He knew that it had changed him. His three personas were quite different from each other despite being controlled by one mind. It was as much of an adaptation to differing circumstances as a defensive mechanism. Otherwise, the lines would become blurred, and he might one day become lost. That was another reason why he was clinging to his secrets so desperately, feeling a strange reluctance to let go of the act. Sonny leaned back. Sometimes I wonder what we will become if we succeed. A supreme being must be even further from being human. What about a sacred being? What about a divine one? He remained silent for a while, staring at his tea with a bleak expression. Then he said somberly, "There was a time when I harbored great hate against the sovereigns. Because they were distant, because they were corrupt, because they treated human lives as currency and did nothing when people died." With a deep sigh, Sonny straightened his back and looked at the rustling leaves of the lonesome tree for a while. "And yet, haven't I spent these last few years doing nothing while people died? Such hypocrisy. Of course, I had my reason. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what a single saint does, a pawn can struggle and strive, but the players are the ones who decide the outcome of the game. So right now, I am bidding my time to replace the morally corrupt players. It's for the greater good." A sad smile twisted his lips. "But then I am sure that this is what the sovereigns think as well, that what they are doing, no matter how callous, is for the greater good." Cassie remained silent for a long time, then shook her head decisively. "There is a big difference between us and the sovereigns." Sonny raised an eyebrow. "There is." She nodded. "Yes, it is that we are ashamed of our faults while they are not. It might sound stupid, but that matters. It matters more than you can think." He laughed. "That's it. The only difference is that when we do something distasteful, we feel regret." Cassie shrugged. "There is no need to think in absolutes. It is a fallacy. We also don't send assassins to kill little girls or try to unleash nightmare creatures in populous cities. The extent of one's willingness to do despicable things for what they perceive as greater good is also important, not just the principle. More importantly, we are also competent while they are not. The end only justifies the means if you actually reach the end." She hesitated for a moment and then smiled. "Or if you prefer, one can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, but if they break the eggs and can't even make an omelet, then they shouldn't be allowed into the kitchen. Don't you think?" Sonny chuckled. "That sounds pretty reasonable. Thanks for leveling with me." He picked up the cup and took a sip of the fragrant tea, then leaned forward and smiled. "Now then, shall we discuss the details of how we are going to make this omelet?" Sonny and Cassie were seated across from each other, enjoying tea and refreshments. The courtyard was peaceful and the leaves rustled quietly above them. Other than that, there were no other sounds. The scene would have been picturesque if not for the fact the world was shrouded in absolute darkness. Neither of them had any need for light, and that, too, was a reason why having Cassie here felt comfortable to Sonny. Dirty deeds were meant to be done under the cover of darkness, and although them having tea in a friendly atmosphere seemed innocent enough, in truth, it was a meeting between two people who conspired to usurp the world in a mayhem of violence. There was hardly a dirtier and more treasonous intent than a bloody rebellion. Today, they were going to reveal their cards to each other. Without knowing what each of them was scheming, it would be impossible to form a meaningful cooperation. Cassie was going to relay all the information to Nephi's, of course. She sighed. "Fundamentally, there are two tasks that need to be accomplished. One is to eliminate the sovereigns. The other is to usurp their thrones. Needless to say, both are hard to achieve. She sipped her tea and took a bite from a soft pastry. You should know by now some of the work that has gone into ensuring the former. Ultimately, Nephis is responsible for warfare and conquest. My role in ensuring the downfall of the sovereigns is limited. For now, I have been mainly focused on elevating her renown in the hearts of the people. It's pure propaganda. I have my avenues of manipulating the public opinion, and Jet has the government sources as well. It has been a long road to get where we are now. She smiled faintly. Of course, we were fortunate in many regards. The decision made by the government to turn Nephis into a symbol, back when she had failed to return from the forgotten shore, was a stroke of luck. The reason why they made that decision, the great and tragic legacy of immortal flame and broken sword, is a grim blessing as well. Conquering the second nightmare as a sleeper and being adopted by a great clan added momentum to her rise to glory and breathed new life into her stirring tale. And lastly, the harsh treatment she received from the elders of valor only played into our hand, fueling the flames of her legend. Cassie shook her head lightly. Plus, it is not that hard to embellish Neff's achievements. No, not even so, there is no need to embellish anything. Her past feats are astonishing, and she has fought against the nightmare spell tirelessly for the past 4 years. She is always on the forefront, spilling her own blood for someone else's sake. Better yet, she has never lost a battle after becoming a saint. The number of lives she has saved is incalculable. So, it's embarrassing to admit, but my job as her spy master is rather easy. I just have to fan the flames and help the stories of her deeds spread faster and wider. She took another sip of tea and remained silent for a moment. It is to strengthen the foundation of her domain, of course, but not only for that. If when Nephis faces the sovereigns in battle and vanquishes them, it is paramount that her domain consumes theirs. There is no point otherwise. The sword domain, the song domain, when the war is over, there should only be the immortal flame domain, and it must encompass all of humanity, becoming the human domain. Not only because hundreds of millions of people in the dream realm would be thrust into the first nightmare otherwise, but also to prepare for what comes next. Cassie unhurriedly finished her pastry. There are a lot of things that must be done to achieve that. Nephis is already immensely venerated by the people, but when the time comes, she has to be acknowledged by the saints who hold dominion over the citadels. They must pledge their loyalty to her after Kai's song and anvil of valor are gone. It would be simpler to eliminate all the loyalists and raise new ones to replace them, but those loyalists are also the foundation of humanity's strength. So, we have to proceed with a surgical decapitation strike instead of a thorough culling. Then, we must get every legacy clan to bow before the new queen. Her expression darkened a little. There are already more than a few saints who share a bond with Nephis, like Sky Tide of the White Feather clan, who had been mistreated by valor, and whose life we saved during the Battle of the Black Skull. There are others, as well, who have been helped by her in recent years. The government will follow Jet, and we even have a few connections in the song domain. However, there is still a lot of work to be done on that front. If there is a saving grace to all that, it's that the weight of an individual in the era of the nightmare spell is infinitely greater than it had ever been before, because one person can indeed be more powerful than an army. If Nephis is the only supreme left standing, then many people would feel compelled to submit, simply because resisting her would be a tall task. She closed her eyes for a moment, a tired expression on her face. Still, there has to be a neat story to create a veil of legitimacy. And that is much harder to manifest out of thin air. As things are going, the assassination attempt on Nephis would be used as the reason for the war, so, in a way, the war will start from her. If we want everyone to accept her ending it, then we must position her as the voice of those who are opposed to the war from the very start. That way, when she betrays her adoptive clan and eliminates both sovereigns, We can present it as a courageous person making a reluctant choice to stop two warmongering tyrants, not a murderous opportunist who wants to become a tyrant herself. A peacemaker, not a usurper. Her tea was growing cold. That is it in broad strokes. Now for the details, where do I even start? After that, Cassie went into a detailed explanation of all the schemes she was weaving behind the scenes, every resource at Neff's disposal, every connection, every clandestine preparation, every strategy and tactic they had developed for the eventual battle against the sovereigns. She spoke for quite some time, to say the least. The scope of it all was nothing short of daunting, so much so that Sonny doubted which one of them had 7 bodies for a moment. The work had started a long time ago, pretty much immediately after the Forgotten Shore. However, it had only truly ramped up in the last 4 years. It seemed like neither Cassie nor Nephi's had rested even for a minute after becoming saints. And yet it still didn't seem enough. How could it be, if their goal was so ambitious? Not only did they want to bring down the current rulers of the world, but also to put the crown on Neff's head. After a while, Cassie grew quiet. By then, one of the avatars had replaced the tea kettle several times, as well as delivered more refreshments. Sonny sighed, then shook his head slightly. I understand that the actual battle with the sovereigns is not your responsibility, Cassie. Nephi's is in charge of that. However, I still think that you are treating the act of killing them too lightly. Your preparations are insufficient. Your approach is too reliant on simply willing victory into existence. Sure, that is exactly what Nephi's is known for, but still. There is a huge hole in the plan. He lingered for a few moments, then smiled darkly. Luckily, I am here to fill it. Sonny remained silent for a few moments, then stood up. Please follow me, I want to show you something. Cassie rose, and they walked together through the impenetrable darkness. As they did, he spoke in a tone of indifference. You know a lot about what I've been up to after becoming a saint. For a while, I did not even have plans of ever returning, so my preparations are not as extensive as yours. Still, I've been working on bringing down the sovereigns earnestly, in my own way. She nodded. Your involvement is both welcome and appreciated. You might want to be modest, Sonny, but there is really no need to. There are very few saints more powerful than you, maybe even none. So, your presence alone is significant enough to change the balance of power entirely. Sonny smiled. Who says that I want to be modest? Yes, I am powerful. Not only am I powerful, but each of my shadows is also a walking calamity. There are only 6 people in the world that I am inclined to be wary of: the 3 sovereigns, Mordred, Nephi's, and you. His smile widened. And look at that, I've joined hands with 2 of them to defeat the rest. I'd be afraid of us if I was someone else. They returned to the inner sanctum of the temple and entered the stairwell to the underground level. Sonny's smile dimmed a little. Returning to my preparations to kill the Supremes. Make no mistake, I am determined to achieve supremacy without venturing into a nightmare as well. It's just that while Nephi's is prevented from doing so by circumstances, I simply can't. Because, well, you know. Sadly, I must admit that I am half a step behind her in that regard. Which is why my plan revolved around battling at least one of the sovereigns as saints. They reached the great underground hall, which was drowning in darkness. Sonny had hidden it from Nephi's the last time around. However, Cassie was witnessing the world through his eyes, so she could see everything that he could see. She was momentarily frozen in place. Don't worry, it's safe. The hidden level was like a reflection of the main hall, as if someone had flipped the entire temple and put it below ground upside down. The great pillars of black marble descended from the tall ceiling and rested on the floor, and silence reigned in the vast expanse of solemn emptiness. There were only 2 differences: the absence of the altar and the mystical circle that took the entirety of the far wall. The circle itself looked quite striking. It was as if the great wall of black marble had turned into liquid once and swirled around an invisible axis before solidifying in a sudden ripple. It was both orderly and chaotic, enthralling and unnerving, but mostly beautiful. It was also capable of absorbing a vast amount of essence like a bottomless vortex. Because of that, it emanated a sense of magnetic pressure. Cassie was stunned by the sight. What kind of sorcery is this? Sunny looked at the great circle, too. A kind that is much older than all the rest. Divine sorcery. If it could even be called that. Sorcery was something that followed a framework of laws and principles to shape the world, usually by manipulating soul essence. Divine sorcery, however, was simply a manifestation of a deity's will. There were some tricks to it, no doubt. Otherwise, there would be no need for the mystical circle to exist, or for the string of fate belonging to the chain lords to be contained in the 7 knives. However, Sunny could not even begin to guess these tricks. For all intents and purposes, divine sorcery created miracles, not magic. There was a hint of awe in Cassie's voice. What does it do? Sunny remained silent for a moment, then answered evenly. You probably don't know, but the nameless temple has not always stood in Guiltythree. In fact, I found it somewhere else. It is a wandering citadel, and the circle allows it to wander. Cassie's brow furrowed a little. He knew that learning that fact pushed her into rethinking 1,000 of preconceived notions. A few moments later, she turned to him and slowly said, "You put it in Guiltythree as bait." He smiled, allowing her to continue. You knew that a citadel standing in the middle of the future battlefield would possess an irresistible attraction for both song and valor. So, you put your temple here and let your presence be known by delivering those sleepers to the song domain. Then, you just sat back and waited until Nephi's arrived. Instead of infiltrating the sword army, you let them invite you to join. Shower you with gifts and try to appease you, even. Just to have you fight on their side, which was your goal all along. Sunny chuckled. You are half right. Cassie raised an eyebrow. Only half. He nodded. It is true that the nameless temple is bait, but it is also a trap. Sunny inhaled deeply and looked up, as if trying to pierce the marble walls with his gaze. The clash with the sovereigns is inevitable, and one way or the other, it must happen here. Either they will come to besiege my citadel, or I will move it to besiege them. Even if Nephi's manages to become a sovereign, she will still be new and inexperienced as a ruler of a domain. So, she'll need all the help she can get when she faces the enemy. He lingered for a moment. The darkness that surrounds the nameless temple is not one of its components. In fact, well, you might not remember if I tell you where I received it from. Suffice it to say, it is a shard of an ancient domain, a divine domain, the realm of shadows. Sunny sighed. I can't control it and am too weak to claim ownership of it. However, it is still a piece of a foreign domain of unfathomable power. When either of the sovereigns enters it, their authority will be weakened, if not suppressed entirely. Cassie considered his words carefully. Slowly, a hesitant smile appeared on her lips. Then she seemed to think of something else. But your plans would not be limited to just weakening their authority. You are far too thorough to be satisfied with just that. Suddenly, her eyes widened. The great abominations that sleep below the temple. His smile turned a little sinister. Yes, they are a present I've been preparing for the sovereigns, a swarm of great nightmare creatures to welcome them as my guests, freshly freed from a maze of nightmares and burning with furious desire to avenge their imprisonment. Of course, just that is not worthy of a proper welcome gift. I should be a generous host after all. Cassie tilted her head a little. A moment later, she faced him with a flash of understanding in her beautiful blue eyes. In the memories, you had a fifth shadow, a black stallion who wields power over dreams. However, I've never seen him here or with any of your other incarnations. Sonny, where is that shadow?" Sonny grinned. His gaze fell down at the floor of the nameless temple. After a while, he said, "Nightmare is busy with an important task. He is lulling a special guest into slumber, the centerpiece of my welcoming committee." He faced Cassie with a cold expression. "A very nasty creature of the cursed rank. Since we're inviting the sovereigns, we should have a guest of honor, don't you think?" Nephis had judged that the only way to defeat the sovereigns was to become supreme. However, Sonny had held a different opinion. He had been fully prepared to face them as a saint, just as he had faced countless adversaries of a higher rank than him in the past. People like him were forged by bringing down creatures more powerful than them, so in principle, there wasn't much difference. All he had to do was study the enemy, ensnare them in a net of deceit and treachery, and then put his life on the line. Wait for them to break themselves against each other, and then deliver a fatal strike to finish off the battered foes. That was why he had made the nameless temple into a trap, and sent Nightmare to assemble a swarm of slumbering horrors. The dream curse was a frightening power. It spread unseen, infecting those unfortunate enough to contract it one after another. Its influence was subtle and insidious, and by the time the curse was ready to pull its victim into the maze of nightmares, it was already too late to resist it. Of course, the great nightmare creatures slumbering under the temple still tried. They struck against the walls of the dream prison, just like Sonny had done in the Kingdom of Hope. The nightmares subjugated by his shadow were continuously destroyed, breaking apart under the onslaught. However, at the same time, Nightmare conquered more of them. The new dreams he collected belonged to abominations of vast and terrifying power, and so, the walls of the dream maze grew stronger and stronger, as did the dark destrier himself. Still, it was a daunting task for Nightmare to lull a cursed being to sleep. Sonny's steed had been at it for many months already. The nightmare creatures populating the area of the hollows around the cursed one's lair had succumbed to slumber one after the other. Then, the fallen deity itself was slowly infected, one drop of insidious poison at a time. The cursed one had resisted for a long time, but eventually the dream curse seeped into its mind, body, and soul. At first, it would grow sluggish sometimes, then it would doze off for a minute or two before recovering. Finally, it fell asleep. Its slumber was still restless and shallow, but Sonny was certain that he would be able to pull it into the underground hall of the nameless temple before the sovereigns came. Of course, his preparations were flawed as well. He had started on this plan not long after returning to civilization, still disoriented by the changes that had happened in his absence and badly informed. Sonny sighed. It was not that Nephis was incapable of constructing a plan to clash with the sovereigns as a saint. She was experienced in slaying overwhelming foes as well. It was just that it was not an option for her, because after the chain of nightmares, the two domains were holding the equivalent of an entire quadrant's population hostage. If the sovereigns were eliminated without a new supreme taking their place, the dream realm would drown in human blood. And Nephis had made it clear in the Crimson Spire that she did not only care about reaching her goal, but also about reaching it the way she wanted. So, as Sonny saw it, both of their plans had to succeed if they wanted to achieve an acceptable outcome. What are the chances that nothing will go wrong? There were many unpredictable factors. Mordred was a wild card, so were the sovereigns themselves. There was also the third supreme, Asterion, who was mysteriously missing. But they had no choice but to try. He looked at Cassie. That is the gist of it. I think that we stand a chance if things go right for us. If things go wrong, which they will, I'm sure, then, well, I guess we'll have to improvise. She remained silent for a while, still stunned by the brazen audacity of his simple, but simply unbelievable plan. who would place a citadel in the middle of a death zone, fill it with sleeping great nightmare creatures, kidnap a cursed one, and then bait the sovereigns into causing the swarm of horrors to wake up. A thing like that was nothing short of unthinkable, and yet the Lord of Shadows had not only thought it, but also made it true. She shook her head slowly. Improvisation, yes. Then Cassie took a deep breath and composed herself. The key to good improvisation is being prepared. Sunny smiled. I expected you to have a contingency. Cassie was someone who had mastered the art of guiding events in a desired direction with a soft hand. A rigid plan was destined to fail, but if one was flexible enough, no unpredictable event could become an insurmountable obstacle. The success of the astonishing web of schemes she had woven to give him a chance to be free was proof that her approach worked. So she would have had something in mind for the inevitable clash with the sovereigns. The young woman sighed. It is nothing revolutionary. You should know well as an experienced hunter, one should study the enemy before confronting them. The sovereigns are shrouded in mystery, but if we want to strike them down, we need to know them. Their upbringing, the environment in which they were formed into people they are, their youth. How the Broken Swords cohort was formed, how it rose to glory, how it fell apart. All of that and more. A somber expression appeared on her face. Needless to say, most of that information is either erased or twisted to such a degree that learning anything truthful from it is impossible. I've been trying to uncover as much as I can, but it hasn't been easy, and most of all, I've been very cautious, afraid to attract attention. The King of Swords still doesn't trust Nephis that much after all. Being discovered would mean certain death. She remained silent for a few moments, then added, but that is about to change. Once the war starts, everything would be thrown into chaos. That is when we'll be able to act more boldly. With my ability to read memories and perceive many things and your versatile arsenal of stealth and infiltration abilities, if the two of us put our minds together, I'm sure that we can uncover a great number of secrets under the cover of the mayhem. Cassie took a deep breath, including the most important one. Sunny gave her a long look. What do you think is the most important secret? Cassie hesitated for a while, then faced him and said quietly, you are right. Our battle plan is too vague, but there is something that can make the odds much more favorable, a piece of information that is as important as it is tightly sealed. At the end of it all, I suspect that the success of our entire endeavor will be decided by whether we manage to solve that mystery or not. Her beautiful eyes grew cold. The single most important thing we must learn are the flaws of the sovereigns. If we grasp their flaws, victory will be ours. If not, all that awaits us are the flames of hell. Sunny looked at her silently for a while. Eventually, he said, you want to steal the secret of their flaws? Cassie lingered for a bit, then smiled. Yes, and I want you to help me steal it, Sunny. There was a lot more to talk about, so they returned to the courtyard and immersed themselves in a detailed discussion of the upcoming war. Now that both knew what hidden cards they held, they could work out how to deal with a great number of possible events effectively. At the same time, more issues were uncovered as they discussed tactical solutions. For example, Cassie possessed a much deeper knowledge of what aspects, abilities, and memories the main combatants of both domains possessed. She could share all that knowledge with Sunny, which would help him deal with these people on the battlefield, should the need arise. He had collected a lot of information in the last year, but she knew more. So, he felt a subtle sense of excitement as many of the gaps in his understanding of the playing field, the players, and the figures they would move were covered one by one. Still, it was a strange conversation. Neither of them had the ability to predict how the war would turn out exactly, so they were simply preparing themselves to face the unknown as best they could. The rulers of the great clans were having similar meetings, without a doubt. Granted, theirs were much more crowded and ostentatious. Sonny also knew that, although he was facing Cassie, Nephi's was passively participating in the conversation as well. The blind seer had the ability to communicate with her telepathically, after all. So, she was both talking to him and relaying the necessary information to Nephi's at the same time, asking for her input when it was needed. After a while, it seemed like they had finally exhausted the deep well of things that needed to be discussed urgently. Finally, silence enveloped the nameless temple once more. Cassie poured herself more tea and picked up the cup, turning to the lonesome tree. After a while, she spoke evenly. The situation is developing rapidly in the waking world. Clan Valor has already leveled accusations against Master Dar and Silent Stalker. They are not pointing directly at Clan Song, yet, but when the Queen inevitably refuses to support the investigation, it would be all too easy to make it seem as if she is implicated. She let out a deep sigh. Both domains are boiling with indignation. The citizens of the Sword domain are in outrage over the attempt on Nef's life, while those in the Song domain are appalled at being accused of it. Passions are burning hot, and all the seeds of discord that had been planted earlier are blooming. The situation is highly volatile. If this continues. The young woman hesitated for a few moments. I'm afraid that peace won't outlive winter. Come spring, one of the sovereigns will declare war. Spring was roughly a month away. Sonny knew these facts himself, but he still couldn't quite believe that the calamity was so near. Had the ancient people felt the same way in the days before the Doom War? A month was not a lot of time at all. He closed his eyes for a moment. I won't be able to forge the sword for Nephi's in time. Nor would he be able to solve the mirror maze below the true bastion in time. Not to mention that he had not even gotten close to infiltrating the Jade Palace yet. It seemed that he would only be able to gain more fragments of Weaver's lineage after the rulers of the two great citadels were gone. Unless he wanted to leave his main body and one of the 6 shadows on the sidelines, leaving himself in a weakened state for the carnage in Godgrave. What was he going to do with the humble shopkeeper once the war started? Nephi's would leave Bastion, Cassie too. Was he really going to stay? Sonny sighed, then looked at his blind companion. I don't think that our private deal can continue. Cassie had agreed to hide his presence in the true bastion in exchange for reading his memories. Sonny could only sneak there when the moon was full, and if the war was going to start in a month. She remained silent for a moment. There is still a full moon left before the war. Sonny shook his head dejectedly. I don't think that I'll be able to conquer that maze in a single night. Still, there is one more memory I want to show you. A pale smile appeared on his lips. So how about we do it right now? Cassie was a little startled. Now here. He nodded. We are alone, and no one will disturb us. I'll have more time to explore the maze if I pay for your services in advance. She seemed a little hesitant. Are you sure? Instead of answering, Sonny finished his tea, then stood up and moved his chair closer. Quite sure, look into my eyes. Cassie remained motionless for a few moments, then did what he had told her to do. Sonny thought back to the forgotten shore. He was laying on the weathered stone, staring dispassionately at the empty black sky. His face was motionless, and his eyes were empty. He had scaled the statue of the knight a day or two ago, and simply remained there without moving ever since. This was where he had first arrived at the forgotten shore, all those years ago. There was no feeling or desire in his heart. How did I end up on this damn statue, all alone again? Life was such a funny thing. He had worked so hard and suffered so much, but here he was, right where he had started. What was he supposed to do now? He remembered the black mirror of the sealed sea once more, feeling regretful for not diving into its dark depths. That would have been a fitting way to end it all. But he had already decided against it, so there was no going back. Instead, he would just stay here for a while more. Another day passed in deafening silence. And then another. And then Sonny grew bored. It seemed that boredom was a much more powerful emotion than all the rest, because he was still tormented by it, even when nothing else was able to bother him much. Eventually, Sonny let out a frustrated sigh. This is seriously tedious. Muttering a curse, he sat up and looked around. All right. There was nothing more he wanted to see on the forgotten shore, so it was time to decide where he was going to go next. The Hollow Mountains lay south, the Nightmare Desert lay east. No one knew what lay west and north. So these were his two choices. Follow the mountains west, or venture in the opposite direction of where humans lived. Let's get as much distance between me and humanity as possible. Sonny smiled faintly, then stood up. In the past, it was an arduous process for him to descend from the colossal statue. But now he simply stepped and fell down, turning into a crow at the last moment. Opening his wings, he glided on the cold wind and flew above the ashen desert. It was time to delve into the unknown. Before leaving the statue of the night behind, Sonny hesitated for a while, and then manifested one of his avatars. Taking control of that incarnation, he left a tether on the ancient stone. Sonny had the ability to possess 7 bodies now, but he still only had a single soul. Each of his incarnations was nevertheless capable of having its own tether. He wasn't sure that he would want to return to the forgotten shore, but since crossing the Hollow Mountains again did not sound particularly pleasant, decided to leave himself a path, just in case. With that done, Sonny went north. Riding Nightmare, he traversed the silent darkness at a measured pace. The hooves of his tenebrous steed rustled softly in the ashen dust, and with each day, the distance between him and the distant human territories continued to increase. He had never visited the northern reaches of the forgotten shore before, so everything here was new to him. Granted, there was not much to look at times. Curious landmarks appeared on the horizon, but none of them managed to pique his interest. There were crumbled ruins, bones of ancient leviathans, and frames of rotten ships. He left it all behind, feeling calm and unburdened. There was nothing he had to accomplish and no looming necessity urging him forward. Time lost all meaning to him. He slept when he was tired and ate when he was hungry. Other than that, Sonny did not concern himself with anything. Of course, he still forced himself to maintain vigilance. There could still be nightmare creatures left on the forgotten shore, and even if there were none, it was a bad idea to break the habit of always paying attention to his surroundings. Eventually, the landscape around him changed. Sonny first noticed that there was less and less dust covering the ground. Then, patches of dark soil started to appear with increased frequency. That meant that the coral labyrinth had been sparser here once. A few days later, he started to encounter tall hills. There were more of them the further north he went, standing in a strangely orderly manner. After investigating one of the hills, Sonny discovered that it was artificial in nature. He could sense a vast burial chamber somewhere far below him. It was a barrow. Climbing to the top of the burial hill, Sonny looked around and counted. However, there were too many of them to count. Giving up after a few hundred, he sat down and stared into the darkness for a while. Then he stepped into the shadows and descended into the burial chamber. A broken sarcophagus stood there, at least 10 meters in length. Inside were the bones of a nameless giant. There were remains of crude armor covering the bones, but time had erased all clues of who was buried here and by whom. There was no vengeful wraith waiting for Sonny in the burial chamber. Nevertheless, he suddenly felt cold sweat rolling down his spine. Trusting the sense of dire premonition, he threw one last look at the sarcophagus and dissolved into the shadows. Returning to the surface, Sonny looked at the boundless black sky and climbed into the saddle. Even Nightmare seemed nervous in the vicinity of the ominous hill, so he wasted no time to leave. Riding north, Sonny couldn't help but remember the nightmare gate near Rain's school. The abominations he had fought that day were called the Barrow Wraiths. Were they, perhaps, connected to the builders of these barrows? The next day, he saw sunlight for the first time in a long, long time. At first, Sonny did not even realize what was happening, thinking that there was something wrong with his eyes. But then, he understood that he wasn't seeing things. The impenetrable darkness of the empty sky was indeed turning paler. Stunned, he dismounted and sat on the ground, looking at the eastern horizon. As the sky brightened, color slowly returned to the world, from black to midnight blue to pale lilac, and then, finally, beautiful magenta that gave way to a golden dawn. The sun rose above the horizon like a chalice of divinity, illuminating the world. How strange! Sonny's face was wet. He didn't even know why he was crying. He didn't feel particularly sad or happy or awed. It was just pleasant to witness something beautiful, to not be lost from light anymore. His eyes had just grown accustomed to the peaceful darkness, perhaps. "I've left the forgotten shore." He smiled. Sonny was pretty sure that no other human had ventured that far north before. He had discovered a new region of the dream realm. That meant that there would be nightmare creatures waiting for him in the unexplored wilderness. Still, he wasn't discouraged. His reserves of food were running quite low, after all. When the sun rose and the sky was painted gray, Sonny continued on his way. This time, he was especially careful, knowing that unknown horrors could attack him at any moment. Soon, a dark line appeared on the horizon. He assumed that there would be another mountain chain barring his path, but was proven wrong after getting closer. Sitting in the saddle, Sonny looked ahead with an emotionless face. Out there in front of him, a sea of jagged black pillars was rising into the sky, each as wide as a tower. It was as if countless dead giants were reaching toward the sky with twisted, skeletal fingers. The pillars were the blackened, broken trunks of great trees. He was looking at a destroyed forest of titanic proportions. Sonny was struggling to imagine how tall the trees had been before they were broken and toppled, and how vast the forest was. All that he could tell was that it was a land meant for deities, not mortals. Urging Nightmare forward, Sonny slowly entered the burned forest. Despite the thousands of years that had passed since it was devoured by flames, the scorched trees had not decayed and crumbled into dust. They were still intact, just broken. It was as if someone had vengefully shattered each one, so that none remained standing. The broken trunks covered the ground, intertwined into an impassable disarray. Most of them were as wide as roads, stretching at steep angles or sloping down into the dark depths of the deadfall. The layer of broken trees must have been several hundred meters thick, and there was no telling what hid in the gaps between the charred remains of the ancient trees. Sonny had no desire to find out, so he sent Nightmare onto the nearest horizontal trunk. Moving forward wasn't easy, since he often had to change directions, going up and down or jumping from one fallen tree to another. A few hours later, Sonny encountered his first foe. It was a black, glistening millipede that lunged at him from under the deadfall. Its armored body was about 3 meters in length, as wide as an adult man's torso. Instead of a pair of mandibles, it had an eerily human mouth full of sharp, needle-like fangs. The millipede was a corrupted beast. Sonny did not move from the saddle and simply turned his head with a dark look. Before the creature could reach him, dark tentacles rose from the blackened surface of the dead tree and enveloped it, slamming the abomination down. Then, they moved like saws, their undersides turning into sharp blades. A few heartbeats later, the millipede was sawn into a dozen bleeding chunks. It struggled weakly and then grew still. Sonny dismissed the shadows and stared at the gruesome remains incredulously. Then, he sighed and looked up. "I'm supposed to eat that." before he could jump off the saddle to harvest the millipede's meat and soul shards, though he sensed a tide of shadows moving in his direction. Soon enough, the broken forest came alive. It looked as if a flood of darkness flowed from under the ancient trunks, rushing at him with terrible speed. A deafening rustle assaulted his ears. Sonny cursed in a stifled voice. The flood of darkness was not the second coming of the dark sea. Instead, there were more millipedes slithering towards him. Thousands of them at least, all of the same rank and class as the first one. Sonny was powerful. He was even powerful beyond belief, if compared to an average saint. However, he was not inclined to battle a swarm of thousands of corrupted beasts. Dismissing Nightmare, he turned into a shadow and fled. A moment later, the tide of millipedes flowed over the remains of their fallen sibling, and in a split second, the meat he had been reluctant to collect was gone. Not even a piece of black chitin remained. Gliding away stealthily, Sonny let out a bitter mental sigh. No wonder. No wonder none of the sleepers of the Forgotten Shore had managed to find salvation by trying to reach another region of the dream realm. Even if they somehow managed to traverse thousands of kilometers of the Crimson Labyrinth, hiding from the dark sea at night, all that awaited them beyond the coral was death. Hollow Mountains and Nightmare Desert were a death warrant, but this burned forest was not any better. It was another death zone. Sonny had no doubt that there was no salvation west of the Forgotten Shore, either. It doesn't matter. Leaving the swarm of millipedes behind, he continued to move north. It took Sonny a long time to make his way through the burned forest. He was quickly reminded that he was at the bottom of the food chain. After that first encounter with the swarm of corrupted beasts, he met many more nightmare creatures, most of them much more powerful than the millipedes were. There were plenty of great abominations on the outskirts of the forest. As for its depths, Sonny had not dared venturing there, moving instead in a wide circle. He had evaded some and killed some. His food stores were replenished, but his body was in a sorry state. It was to the point where he had to remain in the form of a shadow for a while, using one of the avatars as the main vessel of his consciousness instead. His incarnations were independent of each other, so if one received a wound, it was not reflected on the rest. Because of that, he could rotate them when there was a need, letting the damaged ones heal while the fresh ones fought. That way, he managed to survive crossing the burned forest. There were days when he moved, days when he rested, and days when he hid himself in the darkness, scouting the way ahead with utmost caution. During one of such days, Sonny witnessed something that rattled him to the core. As his shadow climbed on the taller remnant left behind by one of the burned trees, he could suddenly see deep into the forest, where an enormous depression in the earth was carpeted by broken trunks. And in the middle of that vast plain stood a charred stump. The sight of that stump left Sonny speechless. Its size was truly unimaginable. The surface where the trunk of the colossal tree had broken off was vast enough to be considered a plateau. Each bulging, blackened root was like a mountain. The creases of the scorched bark were like deep valleys, and the shadows populating them were enough to drown entire cities. Sonny could not imagine what could have destroyed such a tree. When it had stood whole, its crown must have brushed against the stars, and the sun must have passed between its branches, following the moon. If there had truly been a world tree, then this had to be its corpse. Somebody had annihilated it, complete with innumerable living beings that must have lived on its colossal branches. I'm so small. Hidden far away, in a dark fissure between two fallen trunks, Sonny smiled darkly. He was so far below the unimaginable tree, and the being who had destroyed it, that even thinking about himself in that context was preposterous. For now, at least. Not long after that, Sonny continued his journey. He arduously made his way through the burned forest and eventually left it behind. By then, the sun did not rise at night anymore. The sky was not entirely black, though. It was illuminated by countless stars, and although the moon did not show itself, he could see a ghostly radiance sometimes, as if it was hidden just out of sight. The weather slowly turned more and more severe. Sunny was no stranger to cold, but still, he was starting to struggle slightly. The ground was slowly devoured by ice. Sunny continued to move north, and at some point he could not see ground at the bottom of the deep cracks in the ice anymore. Instead, there was only water. By then, he really felt as if he was approaching the edge of the world. Sunny journeyed on, overcome by strange excitement. Would he really reach the boundary of the dream realm? There was curvature to the horizon here, so reasonably, this strange world was supposed to be a sphere, just like Earth. So he might end up entering the storm sea from the south. However, reason did not always work in the dream realm. So, Sunny could easily imagine that the world would just end, opening up into an endless dark abyss, or maybe an infinity of billowing white mist, into nothing. What would it feel like to stand on the edge of the world and peer beyond? Suffering from cold and lethal wind, Sunny stubbornly moved further north. There was nothing around him anymore. No ruins, no nightmare creatures, no signs of ancient battles, only the wind, the ice, and the stars. But then, one day, something suddenly appeared in the distance, a shape that was different from all the rest, too orderly and smooth to not be artificial. Barely containing his fascination, Sunny walked in that direction. He moved closer and closer, until the strange structure finally revealed itself. Sunny stumbled. His weathered face suddenly froze. All traces of excitement were erased from it, replaced by a deep, powerful emotion that wasn't quite horror and wasn't quite shock, but very close to both. He swayed slightly. Azza. A slow exhale slowly escaped from his lips. Sunny sank to his knees. Tears rolled from his eyes, turning into drops of ice. Here it's here. It was. A bitter smile split his pale face apart. Out there in front of him, hidden in the ice, stood a small settlement. It was surrounded by a thick wall, which was now broken and covered in snow. There was a large dome-like structure towering above the settlement, painted white against the backdrop of the starlit sky. It resembled a giant, perfectly smooth egg. It was an observatory, a lunar observatory. It was low 49. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story. And if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.